Hey, Ed Lester here from Showtime CarAudio, and today we have a little fun project. We're going to make a Recone. I have here, this is from 2005, it's an Adair Audio Brahma Extreme, and there was only about 14 of these made for a DB Drag World Championship fan. And I got my hands on a couple of them, and we're going to rebuild them with some of the original parts that we have. Now this was one of the Recones made for it in 2005, which had a little mistake. So we want to make fresh Recones, and I'm going to show you how that's done. Here we have all the essential parts of a subwoofer. We have the motor, we have the frame, and we have the parts of the Recone itself and the adhesives to hold them together. We have the voice coil here, and we're going to use a couple spiders. My spiders have the tinsel leads pre-attached. Yours might not, so you would have to attach your own tinsel leads. And then we have the cone with the surround pre-attached. Now, it's important to test fit all of these items together just to make sure they fit. I've tested these spiders on the voice coil and it fits fine. However, the cone is a tight fit. It's a little too tight and I don't want to warp the cone. So what I'm going to do is just take a razor blade and trim just maybe a millimeter of the inside diameter of the cone. So now our cone fits onto our voice coil, and we can move on to the next step, which is determining the depth of the coil to mark where we want to glue our spiders to. Now luckily we do have an original Recone we can copy off of, and all you would do is measure the distance between the bottom of the coil and where the spider is glued to, and we could go from there. But let's do this the fun way and figure out that depth the old-fashioned way by measuring. Here I'm going to take a couple measurements and I'm going to write them down in my notebook, and I set down what I want to measure. We're going to measure the gap height, gap thickness, whatever you want to call it, the coil, which is basically the winding width or winding height, the coil over the gap, and that's going to be the amount of coil we have sticking out of the gap. And then we can figure out the X-max from these measurements, and then we're going to measure where the spider is going to be glued to. And unfortunately, I only have a metal caliper, which is going to stick to the magnet, but that's okay. I'm going to set mine to millimeters, and first we're going to figure out our gap. And this has a nice little, you'll see, comes out the bottom there, so that'll help us line up. And in this one I can look down, and it's a unique motor. This one's not meant, this top plate, it's not meant for motor force. What this is to have a large field for linearity of the motor force, not total motor force. So I can look down, I can see the thickness of the top plate gap of the washer, if you will, and lower this till it's even with it, and right about there. So it's right about 11.5 millimeters. Actually, it looks like I can go down a little further, so you just want to be sure. It's closer to 12 millimeters, it looks like. I'm at 11.9596. That's about 12 millimeters. My eyes could be off a little bit, and that's not too far off of an estimation. Okay, we have 12 millimeters on the gap, and how about our coil? We're just going to measure the winding width, which is the wire itself. Looks to be we have about 44 millimeters. So let's write that down. And we look at our measurements, and this woofer is what's called an overhung voice coil, which means we have a gap of 12 millimeters and a voice coil thickness of 44 millimeters. So the voice coil is a lot larger than the gap, so it's going to overhang outside of the gap. Now, woofers that are built from a factory, the thickness of the gap the thickness of the coil, and the compliance of the suspension are all taken into consideration to create a very well balanced woofer. This might not be the case if you're building a custom woofer and just putting in parts that can kind of fit. So we want to center that voice coil on the gap. And so the center point of the voice coil is 22 millimeters, and that's at 6 millimeters. So we're going to have the difference there hanging above the gap. We're going to have 16 millimeters of the coil over the gap. Now from this we can actually figure out our X-max. Some manufacturers mislabel the X-max because there's actually a spec called the X-lim, which is the excursion limit, which will be when the voice coil slams against the back plate inside. But there should be a fair amount of distance, maybe 10% of the excursion that we have to play with, that we could go above X-max. Of course, it's not going to be as efficient, and there might be distortion, but we can go a little bit above X-max. But all we have to do to figure out the X-max is where the voice coil will leave the gap, that point where it leaves the gap. So we know our gap, we know our coil, how much voice coil we have over the gap. So take 16 from 44, and we have 28 millimeters of voice coil before it comes out of the gap. So our X-max on this woofer is 28 millimeters, one way of course. Now the spider, we have to figure out where to put that on the voice coil. Now what I've done is taken a red marker and carefully measured that 16 millimeter spot on the actual coil. I used red because it blends in, and this ink will burn off once you use the woofer anyway, but it doesn't matter. So I actually need the frame, and I'm going to line up, see if I can see the red, and line up that red line with the top plate of the motor there. So I use my frame, and the reason for this is because you can't just find a spot, you have to know where the spider is going to mount on the woofer. And I just kind of slide that spider over there loosely so I can adjust it. And I look for that line. And you want a well lit area, and you just try and line it up as best you can and slide the spider until you get to that point. So what I'm doing is just looking through the vent holes at the red line and pushing the voice coil down until that red line meets the top plate. And once I get that, I can pull it out and measure it. Now, using a nice flat surface like a table, I can line it up and see it's right about 70 millimeters. Now once I have this, I'll just use my pencil, and on the former itself I'll mark a line, and I'll take this off and just use my caliper to measure and draw a circle around the entire coil. Now I measure and mark this line with the caliper because it's a little bit more crucial, and the spider does warp and flex. So I'll spend the most of my time lining this up perfectly before I glue anything, because like I said, this is a very crucial part. You want alignment perfect. If it's off, if it's crooked, then your coil is going to be crooked and it's going to rub. So I'll take a lot of time just to line it up. And when I used to do manufactured subwoofers, I would use a jig. But for custom, this is probably the only way to go. Just make sure you measure a bunch of times before you put your glue bead down. And you can check your measurement. I'll show you how. Now when I set it pretty even, I'll take something around the same height. Now I had the original Recone, so that's a good thing to use. But you can use even a ruler taped to the wall and just pick one line. And all I'm doing is turning the coil and the spider, and just by line of eyesight seeing where it might deviate. Now the edges of spiders sometimes warp a little bit, so I could use the top, use the roll, and all you need is a visual reference just to see. And if it's above or below, then just pull it down or up accordingly to get it very even and very perpendicular to the coil itself. And once it's straight, and only when you get it set, then you can go and glue it. Now that I'm satisfied with the positioning of the spider, I can go ahead and glue. Now I'm going to do multiple spiders, so I only want to do one glue bead on the bottom of this spider and make it very light. Personally, I like to do multiple light glue beads versus one heavy bead. There we have a nice light glue bead, and we'll use the accelerator. With the top spider with leads, this is where you want to take into consideration the orientation, because you want the leads to line up, obviously. And you have to work quite quickly because the glue will start to set before you're done working, even if you haven't applied the accelerator. And that's because there's still some accelerator in the air. And this one is going to be a little bit heavier of a bead because the top spider is going to basically squish down on it. You can use some sort of edge or just your fingertips and push that center down as far as you can. And do it very quickly all the way around. You can see the glue coming out. Now for the outer edge, sometimes I use paper clips to hold them together. For added strength, I'm going to go ahead and smear a little glue on the outer edge of the spiders, as well as put a thicker bead, a wider bead, on the coil. And now I'm going to test fit the cone and just check clearance, make sure everything's alright. And it's actually at this point that you can build your woofer. You can glue in the spiders first and then put the cone on, but I'm building a whole recone, so I'll glue the cone. I find that easier anyway. And I'm looking in here at the gap in between the spiders and the cone, and I find that I do have a pretty substantial amount of space, so I'm going to glue the top of the spiders. You can see here how you can glue down the spiders first and then put your cone on. But what I'm going to do is just glue around here on the top of the spiders, give it a little strength. This is going to be kind of a light bead, just like on the bottom. Now you have to take into consideration the leads. If you have flat wire, you can feed it up through the gap in between the coil and the cone. On these, I'm going to do what the original has done, since it's using quite thick round wire. I'm going to poke holes in the cone and feed the wire through and loop it up over and solder it to the voice coil. You can probably use a drill to do this, but I'm just using a very sharp pick and poking a couple holes just to run the wire through. Okay, I'm going ahead and I fit my wires through and push the cone down on the coil. Just make sure you pull them through and then it sits down. And once you have that done, you can sit the whole thing in the woofer. And we're going to get the cone glued on. For this part, I like to shim it into the framing motor itself. This allows the cone to be a little bit more straight, and I know some people do them without the frame and motor around, and it can be done very carefully. Just I think that it runs more of a risk of having a cone that might be off or wobble a little bit. So I'm going to shim it out. Make sure everything is centered. Then also clamp down spiders, which is not that important to do. When we push down the cone, make sure it's sitting as far as down as it should. Like I said, instead of building a recone, it's at this point that you can glue it down permanently if you already glued the spiders. But I'm going to pull it back out after this, so all I'm gluing to is to the voice coil right in there. And like anything else, use a small bead first. Now that I have a bead holding the top, this is why I like to take it back out, is I have a gap there I can glue under the cone. And this takes quite a bit of patience and maybe some skill, I would guess, because the nozzle of the glue, the tip of the glue, does not reach. So I have to let it drip. And of course gravity helps here. Now on this, because of the tinsel leads, I just used my pick and pulled out a little bit of the tinsel lead just to make sure they're slack during movement. And when I do that, I can then glue a tab to hold it there, glue a little bit, and then solder it. Okay, once you're done soldering there, let it cool, and then you can take your glue, trim the leads, fold them down, and secure them with glue, and then put a stronger bead on the top of the cone to the coil. Going a little wider, smearing the glue more onto the cone and further up the former of the coil. Making it more surface area basically, which equals more binding force on the adhesive. Then we hit it. And there we have it. That's pretty much our recone right there. And we're all done. And now we can go and build a bunch of these and sell them off as recones for this woofer, or we can go and recone this actual woofer and build it, finalize it, and make a completed woofer. So that's what I'm going to do in the next video. Go check out the how to recone a woofer, my part 2.